Your Worship, we're now live streaming. Over to you. Thank you.
Right. Welcome everybody to the full council meeting, 7th of April 2022. Welcome to the public who are online, staff members, and of course, my elected colleagues. Councillor Hanford, would you like to read the council blessing, please?
Yeah, sure. Morene te whānau, ia mātou e whiriwhiri ana i ngā take kei mua i o mātou aroaro. E pono ana mātou ka kaha tonu ki te whakapau mahara hua pai mo ngā hāpore e mahi nei mātou. Me kaha ki mātou katoa kia whaihua, kia tōtika tā mātou mahi, a mā te maia te tira whakamua me te hihiri kataia, te arahi i roto i te kotaitanga me te aroha.
Thank you. Item 3, apologies. Any apologies?
We have Community Board Chair James Westbury handing in apologies today.
James Westbury. Anybody else? No? I move that the apologies be accepted. Can I have a seconder for that? Janet, all in favor, just give me a thumbs up, they'll do. Yeah, carry. Item number 4, declarations of interest relating to items on the agenda. Anyone? Oh.
Your Worship, we have Councillor Hanford with her hand up. I'll just get her to unmute.
Councillor Hanford?
Yeah, just signalling that in regards to item 10.3 on the agenda, the social impact grants, that I am a trustee on the Kāpiti Youth Support Board. Okay.
Can staff respond in the sense of being online? What's the process? What do you do?
I would suggest that Councillor Hanford not take part in the discussion and debate and consideration of that item, and that the best way to signal that in an online environment would be to probably turn off her camera for that item and to make sure that she's still on mute. And Mr. Mayor, at that point in the conversation, it might be good for you to acknowledge again Councillor Hanford's interest that she's declared and that she won't be participating.
And she would abstain from the vote. Right. Thank you, Councillor Hanford. Item number 5 and 6, no business there. Public speaking time for items relating to the agenda. Fiona or Tanika? No one?
There are not any requests for public speaking today.
Leave of item number 8B, leave of absence? No? Good children. Matters of an urgent nature, I've not received any. Mayor's report, no. I've already signaled to councillors, we're now looking at item number 10.
Your Worship, Councillor Coates has his hand up. I'm not sure if that relates to one of those earlier matters.
Please.
Your Worship, I note that there is no Mayor's report for this meeting and there wasn't one for the previous meeting. I know within that time, for example, you've had a meeting with Greater Wellington Regional Council over a number of matters, including the regional rep for Kāpiti. So I'm just wondering when we can expect an update on that particular meeting and also your other activities.
Yeah, the next council meeting, I will give you a comprehensive one. There's only about 1 or 2, not very much given all my public events and all have been sort of muted because of COVID, but I will.
Thank you. Right,
moving on. You would have received an email from me saying that I want, with your leave, swap item number 10.3 to be the first item under the reports, and we'll swap it with the current 10.1 on the Communities for Local Democracy. I think the reporting officer is in Christchurch, but she's present here at the moment. She's got a funeral to attend, I understand. So Janice, you're reporting on this.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you for your flexibility to the councillors to shuffle the agenda around a little bit. I'll make a few brief comments ahead of handing over to Claire Iwi, Senior Advisor within the Connected Communities team, who will take you through the report and introduce the panel representative that we have joining us today. So I guess by way of brief introduction, you will remember that at the end of last year, you resolved to run a social impact grants program for this financial year using the funding assigned to the social investment program as a precursor to the work to develop the next 3-year package of contracts as part of the social investment program moving forward. This application process has been completed. The applications have been considered by independent panels, and today's staff will take you through briefly the process that was followed. There's an opportunity for a panel member to make some comments for you before you then move to considering the recommendations of the panel. I just want to acknowledge the agility that has been needed on the part of staff and panel members to navigate this process while COVID has been making its way through our communities. And I thank you for your time and consideration today, and I'm going to hand over to Claire now.
Just before then, Councillor Hanford, do you want to exercise your right to disappear from the table? Thank you. Yeah, Claire.
Tēnā koutou katoa ngā rangatira o te kaunihira o Kāpiti. Nei rā te mihi mai o ha kia koutou, kua tai mai ki tēnei hui. Firstly, I'd really like to acknowledge our panel of panels of independent local experts. The work required to come to the recommendations required significant time. The panel was thorough, analytical and considered, and devoted a considerable amount of their time speaking to all the applicants and others to get a full picture of the proposed projects. When they met virtually, they were robust, logical and reasoned discussion around the decision making, and they were all very diligent in their role in this process. In the report, you'll see the process for evaluation has been made quite clear. We opened our the funding. We had opportunity to talk to all applications, all organisations, and talk them through the process. We went with 2 separate panels for the separate funding streams, and each fund was treated in isolation. Panel members were asked to make recommendations on the applications for the fund they were involved with, and encouraged not to ruminate on the concern that some organisations may be applying to both funds. I would like to make a point that there is one small mistake in the table of funding recommendations for the district-wide fund on page 124 of the agenda. The shed project requested 22,000 and the recommendation to fund is 21,525.66, not 21,525.661. So apologies for any confusion or concern that this may have caused.
Are you open for questions now?
I'd just like to introduce Eddie Bisdee. Eddie's one of our panel members for our district-wide panel, and I'd just like to ask him to say a few words about how he found the process, and he will be open to any questions as well around the decision-making process.
Tēnā koe, Eddie. Good to see you. Can't hear you.
Sorry, Eddie, you'll just have to unmute.
Right now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Tēnā koe, Guru. Tēnā koutou katoa. As Claire said, my name's Eddie Bisdee. I live next door to Claire. And I think that's probably why she asked me to join this panel. I used to be her maths teacher, so I was surprised she asked me. I was very interested to be asked, and I found it a very worthwhile project to see so many groups in this community who were involved with all sorts of things. It was sad that we weren't able to give them all they wanted. There were some obvious things that had to happen. Firstly, we were oversubscribed by about 40%. So obviously we had to do a bit of culling. The obvious culls were ones that really didn't meet the criteria. So they came to nothing. They were not able to be funded at all. But even then, we still had to find more money. So it was a good process. I felt very comfortable with it. We spent the day on a Zoom meeting, and you people are well used to this yourselves, but I'm not so used to it. But I found it a good process, and I felt the panel achieved exactly what they needed to do in the course of the day. So I've been a resident here for 40 years in Otaki, so I know some of these organisations, not that I've got a pecuniary interest or anything, but I know them, and they do such great work for our community. So I commend them to you, and I commend our schedule of quantums to you. So thank you.
Right. Open for questions. I have Councillor McCann.
Kia ora, Eddie and Janice, and thank you very much for doing the work that you've done. From my experience on the major events panels, there's a huge amount of work to go through all of those applications and then to weigh them up. So I've just got a couple of questions, and some of them just want to frame this because this is quite a different process from what we were going to go through prior to COVID. And I think it's just worth asking Janice to summarise what the difference for the current process is from what we were going to do.
Thank you, Councillor McCann. So what had been intended for this financial year was work to take applications or take proposals and work through the development of contracts for the next 3-year social investment program. But there was recognition that both the sector and the council, due to COVID, weren't likely to be in a position to complete that work right now, and that actually there were a range of more immediate needs that the social and community sector in Kāpiti was dealing with as a result of COVID and other challenges that this funding could best address, rather than trying to push forward with the social investment program proper at a time when the sector wasn't ready for it. So that's the main difference. Normally at this stage in the process, we would be considering proposals for 3-year programs of activity, as opposed to one-off grants for, I guess, current needs.
Thank you. And I think it's worth exploring the relationship between the Otaki and the district-wide funds, because that's something that has a significant impact on the decisions today.
Certainly. So through the long-term plan, the council, in response to feedback from Otaki around a range of concerns largely related to equity, the council resolved to establish an additional $50,000 funding specifically for Otaki within the social investment program. I think it's really important to acknowledge that that's not the only funding that Otaki initiatives are potentially subject to within the social investment program. There is a district-wide category, but I think the intent of the council was to have, I guess, an additional step up for Otaki in recognition of the scale of the equity challenges that exist in Otaki. And certainly in some of your conversations this week around the housing and social needs assessment, those challenges around equity have been very clearly on display. So for the purposes of a grants program, where it is a little different to establishing programs that might specifically be targeted to particular equity issues, staff proposed, I guess, addressing equity by keeping the two funds separate so that there was an opportunity for any Ōtaki initiative to receive funding from the Ōtaki Fund, irrespective of whether they had also applied to the district-wide fund. And you can see from the report in front of you that there are some initiatives from Ōtaki that applied to only one fund, and then there are other initiatives that have applied to both funds, and there are recommendations attached to that. Does that answer your question, Councillor McKean?
Thank you. It does, Janice. And I suppose just following up from that, the outcomes that you've seen presented by the two panels broadly fit exactly what you were talking about between both funds, and the potential that you could get what some people might perceive as a double up.
Certainly, in my opinion, I think that we are seeing that intention of trying to create that separation between those two funds being a way to address equity issues. I'm certainly seeing that play out in the recommendations from the panels.
And in terms of addressing the equity issues with COVID-19, have we seen COVID affect different parts of the region differently? And is Ōtaki hardest hit?
I don't know that we can say that Ōtaki, specifically as Ōtaki, is hardest hit, but I think what we're seeing across a number of communities on the Kāpiti coast and more broadly across the Motu is that communities that are significantly disadvantaged already fare worse during COVID and are and have greater welfare and other needs during COVID than communities where there is a lower level of disadvantage.
Moving on to how the panels were chosen, I noted Eddie started off with his personal connections. So I think it's worth a question: how were the panels chosen so that they would reflect the wider community and not just former teachers? Sorry, Janice, you're muted. It's clearly a remark about maths teachers.
It was a remark about maths teachers and being neighbours, neither of which were criteria for selection of the panel. We looked to have a good representative mix of local knowledge, but also understanding of the social and community sector in both of the panels. But I can hand over to Claire to make some more specific comments around the panel selection.
Yes, Eddie was my maths teacher, but that's not the reason I actually asked him. So the panel was, we tried to make it a representative of our whole district, and also look to, we had a couple of representatives of our Māori community, and also we had someone from our disability advisory group, Sue Emirali, on the panel as well. So we tried to have a rounded view on who we chose. Eddie was actually chosen because he actually does know a lot about the social sector in Kāpiti, and it is very difficult finding people that know a lot about the social sector that aren't actually associated closely with the sector itself. So yeah, it was quite a difficult task trying to find people that know a lot about it, live in our community, are local experts, but not actually really associated with any one organisation.
Thank you. I think that's a really good answer, and I think councillors can understand just how hard it is to be divorced from this decision. We've already got one councillor who stood down because there might be a perceived conflict of interest, and I too stood down from a board, although they didn't apply. I've got a question for Eddie, if I may, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah.
Just regarding some of the reasoning here. We obviously don't get to see the full reasoning. So the Kāpiti Seventh-day Adventist Church was declined, and the shorthand is concerns regarding religious recruitment, proselytizing, if I've pronounced that correctly. Eddie, could you give us a little bit more of an explanation as to the concerns that the committee had regarding that particular application?
Okay, I had a good discussion with Anton about this proposal, and I liked lots of aspects of it. They're a relatively unknown group in Kāpiti, or maybe even very unknown group. They were based out of Levin, but they're moving into Kāpiti in some form or another. Their program, it was for anxiety and depression for younger people particularly, and I like lots of aspects of it. It's an American-based program, which I didn't like so much because I didn't know how it could be just dropped into our community, but he assured me that it had been modified for New Zealand use. I hadn't seen the program, but it was a program whereby the group of 10 or 15 or so would meet once a week for 2 hours in the evening. The people there were to pay $50 each to join. That was a worry to some of the members. But Anton assured me that if people couldn't find the $50, they wouldn't be excluded. So his reasoning about the $50 was it was a commitment on their part to come and not just put their hand up and then turn up once and not bother coming the other time. So it was once a week for 2 hours in the evening to sort of cater for people who are working and so on. But the concern was we don't know enough about them. We don't know enough about what they do. There was certainly a feeling amongst some members of the group that the proselytizing aspect may be one, a recruiting aspect may be an aspect. We all know in past years of young American boys here in their white shirts and black trousers on bicycles, cycling around the place, going to door to recruit more members. So it was more probably though about the fact that we know too little about them and too little about their program to give them any funding.
Thank you, Eddie. One of the other comments that's comes through is the promotion of local firms versus those that don't have a connection here. Can you explain some of your reasoning? So, for instance, the menstrual cups, again, you've noted Tauranga-based business couldn't confirm links to local groups. Would you like to expand on that a little?
Yeah, I knew it's not a department I know very much about. I think one of the things was it seemed there were going to be very few cups available for quite a large amount of money, and it just didn't seem to add up. And there certainly wasn't much interest on the part of the group for them. But I don't know much about them at all, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I've got one more question really. It's probably for Janice, and it's around the community food bank, and the reasoning there is deemed business as usual. And could you remind councillors our previous decision around the food bank and why that reasoning has then been used to not include them in this round?
Certainly. So I think the first point to acknowledge is that the Kāpiti Community Food Bank has already received $25,000 of funding from this fund. The council, via the Strategy and Operations Committee, I think, approved a one-off grant to the food bank in the latter part of last year, and it came out of this fund. So that meant that there was $25,000 less available for this stage in the process. Certainly, I believe the panel was of the view that the application provided by the food bank was clearly related to business as usual costs and therefore fell outside the criteria. And that might be something that Eddie wishes to make some further comments on at some point. I guess the other point that I would note is that as well as the $25,000 funding for the food bank from this fund, there was a range of other support provided to the food bank, both financial and in kind, in regards to their occupation of the community centre building. And there have been some additional items redirected to the food bank for the relocation project out of the community centre building itself. So there is a range of support that has been in place for the food bank. But Eddie, are there any further comments you'd like to make in relation to why the panel felt the application from the food bank didn't meet the criteria?
I think without the advice from council staff, the group may have supported it further, but the issue coming up about how much they had been supported financially and the issues about their space and the gear that they'd got seemed unfair to give them more because they'd derived so much benefit recently from the council.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, I just want to signal my desire to move this motion at the appropriate time. Thank you very much for your answers.
Councillor Harborough.
Yes, thank you to the staff and to the panel for the enormous amount of work that's gone into this. I've sat on a lot of grants boards as well and understand how much goes into it and how deeply you look at these applications. And thank you particularly to Eddie for coming along today and speaking and answering questions for us. I just wanted to just dig in a little bit to the applications for the 2 grants and how that's managed. I know that's already been covered off a little bit by the previous questions, but say an application was applying for a particular amount of funding to do a particular project, and they got a substantial amount of that funding from one of the funds. Was that not then communicated to the other panel? And were there any cases where, in fact, the applicant received more funding than they would have originally applied for their project? I'm just a little bit aware that in panels that I've sat on, we have been made aware of other funding that has been previously received, and I'm just interested in the decision not to do that.
I can start by answering that, but I might hand over to Claire to confirm a couple of details following that. It was a deliberate decision to try and keep the considerations separate because the purpose of the specific $50,000 worth of funding for Ōtaki was to address sort of equity and opportunity issues. So we felt that in the context of a grants program, the best way to be able to do that was to keep the processes quite separate so that decisions made in one didn't influence the response to the applications made to the other panel. I don't believe that anybody has received more money than they needed for their initiatives as a result of that. I believe that the initiatives that received funding from both panels have received the funding that they need to deliver the initiative, not more so, but Claire could perhaps confirm that for me.
Excuse me. So the panel hasn't, either panels haven't given any more than what was requested from any of the applicants. There is the one, and the recommendation is in there, that there was some money left over after decision making in the Ōtaki panel, and to give it towards the one of the groups that is providing the COVID response and Manaaki service. In the Ōtaki panel, in the Ōtaki fund, that group actually came through asking for funds that had nothing to do with the service they're providing in Ōtaki for the Ōtaki panel. Not sure whether that
yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that. I'm aware of the decision and the reason behind it in terms of equity. I'm just concerned that there isn't that we don't have people applying for the same activity from 2 funds and getting funded twice by council, and just be interested to understand after this process, you know, how council feels like that went, and even if that didn't happen this time, how that would be addressed in the future, seeing as it's project-based funding, not business as usual funding.
Yes, and we are looking at how moving forward for our social investment funding, we are investigating further how we can be a bit more clear about what the extra 50,000 for Otaki is and what it can and can't be used for. And so there is quite a bit more work to be done in that space.
Yeah, going really well so far though. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet.
Oh, I had a second question actually, and that was about the business as usual funding not being in the criteria. When we set these criteria at the time, I expressed quite a lot of concern around having these funding rounds not accessible for business as usual, because we're finding that a lot of funds are doing that across the country, central government funds, all the funds you have to kind of invent a project to apply for funding for, and you're still left with a shortfall in your business as usual funding. Do staff think that that is an issue for our local community groups, and how do we help them address that issue if this is a common criteria for lots of funding that these groups can apply for?
I have first crack at that, and Claire can add to that answer if she'd like to. I think that the reason why that criteria was applied to this process was about being sensitive to the intent of the funding that was being repurposed to run this grants process. It is social investment funding. It is funding, a significant amount of funding that has been approved for achieving social outcomes and developing new initiatives that improve outcomes rather than funding business as usual activities is one of the core elements of that social investment program. So to be true to the purpose of the funding, that was carried across into this funding round. I do think that there are some real challenges for organisations in the social and community sector at the moment. The cost increases that we are all experiencing in our personal lives, many organisations will be experiencing those in a business context as well. And I don't know that is ultimately something that this council in isolation could solve for organisations in the social and community sector, but I'm certainly happy to have a conversation offline about what the team is hearing and where we might be able to collaborate with others to be able to tackle this issue, because I believe it is certainly becoming more pressing.
Yeah, thank you for that answer, Janice, and I'm sure we'd all appreciate that conversation, particularly following on from our housing and social needs assessment workshop yesterday. Thanks.
Councillor Rendell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My questions are to Eddie. Eddie, on a personal level, I'm disappointed that the Kāpiti Community Food Bank was left out, but you gave the reasons for it. But and then on the second issue, of the number of district-wide grants, how many are based in Waikanai or Paraparaumu? Do you know? Do you have any idea of the mix of grants being given to people residing in Waikanai and Paraparaumu?
I don't think I could answer that question. Well, I could read them all, but Claire might know that offhand. I could spend 5 minutes looking at it, but I'll just ask Claire to respond to that.
No, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, Eddie. It doesn't matter. Okay, I accept that answer. My next question is, Councillor Holbrook raises an important point. There are some organisations and some individuals that apply for grants from community grants from different, there's a number of different community grants made available, and they apply all the time. It's not really double dipping, but they apply and they're successful. And if council staff aren't aware that they have been granted that money, they may give them another sum of money.
I think they were asked on the form to say what other funding they had applied for. So hopefully they were all honest in that response.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Compton.
Thank you. Through the Mayor, I just have a question, just following up from the discussion about the decline of funding for the 7-day Adventists. There's obviously funding that's being proposed for the Kāpiti Impact Trust, and obviously they're a group that's religiously affiliated as well, and from my understanding have some quite significant assets that they own. So what consideration was given, I guess, to the financial position of organisations that were applying to funding, and whether they, and weighing that up against other applicants?
From what I remember about that one, it was a relatively small quantity of funding, very specific to fruit trees and so on. It might have been $2,000 or $3,000. I'm not too aware about the Impact Trust. I don't know much about it. I don't know whether that was discussed about their religious affiliations.
Just looking at this, it's $15,000 recommended.
15, was it? Sorry. Okay.
Claire might have some further comments she wishes to make there.
The Kāpiti Impact Trust have come through for as an extension of their previous 3 years funding around building the capability of the social sector. So I think the difference being is that the Seventh-day Adventists are unknown to our funding streams. We've never had them, to my knowledge, come in through. The program they were proposing is an unknown to our district as well. And because of the unknown, what was in the content, there was concern that there may be more religious content than is what we'd normally like, whereas the Kāpiti Impact Trust, theirs had nothing to do with any counselling or any program. It's around building the capacity of our social sector.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Sorry, I got the two mixed up. It was to Tangata Village that applied for the smaller amount of funding. I got the two mixed up. I'm sorry.
It's fine, Eddie. No other questions. Mr. McCann, Councillor McCann, would you want to move it? Did you say? Councillor McCann, you there?
Sorry, I'm just waiting to be unmuted, Your Honour.
Yep. So you're
I've done
it
it again. I've made you into a judge. Yeah, I would like to move this. I think it's an excellent piece of work, and I'd like to commend the. No,
hold on.
Oh, we need a seconder. Yeah, sorry.
James could second it. Mr. McCann, right of intro.
Jumping the gun again. I would like to move this, and I would like to acknowledge the terrific work that the panels have done. I think it is worth saying that it's a huge amount going through all of those details and then interviewing everyone and then coming up with a report and then having to speak to it online to all of us. Making those decisions is terrifically tough, and I know that they have made those decisions for all the right reasons. I think it's really important that we acknowledge that as councillors, we also made some decisions that we weren't going to just roll on the way what we were planning before COVID, that we have interrupted that to try and help our community through what is a terrifically tough time. So also acknowledge the staff being able to respond to that and changing the process so that we could have this 1 year intermediary step. So I think that's enough comments from me. I think that most of what I would say has come up in those questions, and staff and councillors have been well briefed on the need for this, why we're doing this, and the need for bringing equity back into our decision making. So thank you.
Right, open for debate. Councillor Goods.
Yeah, ironically, I don't really have too much to debate, but more using it as an opportunity to make a comment rather than in question time. Just really want to acknowledge the work of Claire and the team. Eddie, good to see you. Also a previous teacher of mine. Glad he didn't comment on any of my school reports in his introduction. But yeah, having previously been involved in similar processes, understand the incredible amount of work involved with those that have to consider the applications in terms of the background reading, and the tough process through elimination. So you really do want to acknowledge the work of all those that participated in evaluating the proposals. I also want to take a moment to thank the councillors for including the separate fund for Ōtaki. And I'm sure Eddie and those that are Ōtaki based will testify to the difference that that funding will make in that community in addressing that equity issue that Councillor McCann had mentioned. So it was pleasing to see most of the groups on there that I am aware of and the great work that they do being supported by the panel members and by the fund. So, I think it's important to note that and to thank Council for creating this separate fund and look forward to seeing the results from that money being used by those groups, because I do know that it will make a huge difference. So thanks, Eddie, and if you could pass on my thanks to the rest of the team as well.
Okay, thanks, James.
Councillor Elliott.
One other thing, if I could.
No,
add,
hold on.
Sorry,
Eddie.
Sorry.
Councillor Elliott.
Look, thank you very much. Thank you, Eddie, Claire, staff, for being here today. As chair of the Grants Allocation Subcommittee, I do know what it's like to go through these applications and be well oversubscribed and have to say no to groups. It's really hard. So I thank you for your work and your consideration. Had we been able to come and speak in person to community board meetings, I was really wanting this year to ask the Paraparam Raumeti Community Board to ensure their community there applies for funding. It's really great that Ōtaki has a place-based extra grant amount there, but I have really felt in the last year, and especially this year, that Paraparam and Raumeti are becoming very much the poor cousins in our district, and that Paraparam in particular has a real concentration of very, very high needs residents. We have a lot of refugees, we have immigrants, and we have a lot of social housing needs right there, a lot of begging going on. And frankly, we don't see that in Ōtaki anymore. So I really would encourage the community board to go and speak to your community groups and ensure that we look after the people of Parapara Umu and Raumeti, and of course across the rest of the district. But in particular, there are some dire cases there in Paraparam. Kathy, I know, you'll be absolutely aware of what I'm talking about here. So let's hope at the next round that there is consideration across the district and that we are very caring across the whole district. But thank you, and I will be supporting this recommendation today.
Councillor Holbrook.
Yeah, thank you. I'll reiterate everybody's thank you to staff. I mean, it's just such a huge amount of work. But I'd just like to also acknowledge that it's been a work that's gone on for years, and I was part of the panel that set up the criteria for our first social investment fund. I think it was 5 or 6 years ago, and so much work went in by members of the community back then. But we always struggle against this pressure to help organisations meet their everyday needs. So it's hard to stay true to the social investment criteria and priorities. And I believe this time that's really come to the fore, and we see our organisations really structuring themselves to benefit from that and grow as a result. So congratulations. I think this is the result of not just this process, but also that ongoing support that staff provide for these organisations in our community. And I particularly like to acknowledge Claire, who's been doing that work for so long now and so well, and has such a deep connection with our community organisations and other members of the team, including those who have unfortunately recently left. So including Tanya. So thanks to everybody. Thanks so much thanks to the team. Congratulations, Councillor Coots, for successfully advocating for this extra funding in Ōtaki. And yes, agree with Councillor Elliott, we do need to identify those other pockets in our district who are really suffering at the moment and have high needs, and see if we can target some particular help to those other areas as well. So and thanks to the panel. Thanks, Eddie.
Thank you.
Councillor Halliday.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. I certainly want to echo the views. I wasn't actually going to comment as part of this because I think Rob and James and others have articulated very, very well the amount of work that goes into this and the fantastic kaupapa around this. But I'm afraid, sorry, Councillor Elliott, I can't let your comments go unanswered. I take exception to the comments you just made there about my ward and our community board in that area. We do a lot of work with a lot of groups in our area, and a direct result of that is the funding that came to the food bank and other groups. We do a lot of grant applications through our community board as well. You're a district-wide councillor, Councillor Elliott. You're quite welcome to come in and work with groups and work with our community.
Councillor, let's not get.
Yeah, you didn't stop having us, Mayor. So I'm just defending, if you like, my turf, and I think it was actually quite unwarranted. Thank you very much.
Right, that's the end of the debate. The resolutions or recommendations A to H moved by Councillor McCann, seconded by Councillor James Coates. Oh, sorry, right of reply, Councillor McCann.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've got to be very careful because someone told me that my nickname is James Wallace at the moment, so I must be very careful. I do think that councillors have made a very bold decision when we were putting in place the policy to help us, to take us through not only this year, but the following 3 years. So I thank the councillors for their support, for the staff, and for the work that I've tried to support staff to do in this portfolio. I think it's really important that we don't end up bickering about who's getting what, because I know that a number of councillors made sure that this was promoted through every avenue that they had to community organisations. So if community organisations are not applying, we have to, we can't take responsibility for that. We've made sure that the information has been put in front of them. But, you know, we should all keep those conversations going. So thank you very much. I hope we have your support to get this across the line. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
All right. Recommendations A to H, moved by Councillor McCann, seconded by Councillor Coates. All those in favour, can you please?
Your Worship, we have 10 votes in favour.
And 1 abstention?
Not. Councillor Hansford's just away from the table. I can record it as an abstention. Yeah. Okay,
it's carried. Thank you very much for that. We now move to item 10.1. Back to 10. Oh, sorry. Item 10.2. I think staff report by Hamish and Natasha.
Yep, morena, Your Worship, and elected members. Earlier this year in January, we provided a briefing around the discussion today around the housing business assessment process and the update that was underway around housing in particular. And we also touched on what that process looked like and some of the initial findings. The item in front of you today is the final draft chapter following that discussion and the work. And this chapter is going to form part of the final regional assessment that's currently being compiled across the other 4 districts, the Wellington City Council, two Hutt councils and Porirua Council, alongside ourselves for publication in the very near future. Just kind of coming back and reminding the main purpose of the HBA is to help identify how much development capacity we have available under current settings, and looking forward to how much demand we're anticipating into the future. And a key component of that analysis is to help understanding what some of the competing challenges and needs are, and to help support planning and decisions to how we enable for that capacity to meet those needs into the future. The results of the assessment identify that while we have short and medium term capacity available to meet those needs, we do fall short over meeting the long-term needs for the district. So the key component and requirements we have around the housing business assessment is that when we then need to initiate a response to enable capacity to meet those needs into the future. So currently council's well placed to respond to this need in the sense that we've just recently adopted the growth strategy, which looks to how we want to grow well for the next 30 years. And that's being closely followed by the Plan Change 2 process that is underway to enable intensification and to meet some of those requirements under the National Policy Statement. The Housing Business Assessment as well also provides further information alongside the Housing Needs Assessment and Social Impact Assessment that I believe you were updated on yesterday to help provide a picture of the housing continuum, including some of the market movements and changes there affecting housing in the district, and that will help support council's work and partnerships looking to help deliver better outcomes for housing across the community. So just looking to take the report as read and happy to take any questions you might have.
Right, thank you very much. Can I start by asking, now this document, this report will eventually contribute to the regional collection of similar reports, and it will be an informing document to the regional special plan that's coming. Am I right?
It provides evidence and information across the spectrum. So to help support the regional growth framework and its implementation, future processes, that's both within and across individual councils, but also as it applies to areas within the broader area of the region that it applies to.
Yeah,
So noting that only at the moment the HBA requirement currently is looking to just address those 5 councils that's captured under the National Policy Statement. But I believe there's steps underway for the next housing business assessment to look more broadly and reflect consistently across the Greater Wellington area that's in the regional framework.
And eventually these documents will contribute to the creation of a regional spatial plan.
It will help provide the evidence to future processes and ongoing processes.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking at paragraph 14. Am I correct in understanding that you're talking about the realizable demand being inflated by an addition of 20% and 50% respectively for the short and medium term? Am I right?
Correct, yes. That's an additional demand that's added to help support additional competitiveness in the market. And I guess under the old approach of the HBA, it was also to ensure that there's, I guess we used to describe it as a bit of headroom to also respond to any fluctuations in the market short term, while longer term changes might be brought into play to address any shortages around potential demand.
So is that why initially we had figures of 30% or 30,000 increase projected population, and 14,000 houses became 32,000 population and 16,000 houses?
Correct. The population doesn't get inflated, but you're correct on the inflation of the 8,000. Sorry, what is it? 13,852 to the 16,185.
So understanding that, so the additional houses that the methodology inflates, can I describe them as ghost houses? That they are theoretical constructs without any foundation in particular sites, like Paparamo or Taki or Waikana Beach or anything of the sort. Am I right?
Theoretically, it's additional demand. So yes, that could be a kind of correct analogy.
Okay. My next question is on paragraph 36, inserting housing bottom lines. Am I correct that what I'm hearing here is a tool to constrain the market, so you cannot build more than the number that this area can contain, theoretically?
My understanding of this, it was introduced under the recent National Policy Statement changes in 2020. and it's to kind of bring in the figures that we're using in this housing business assessment into the planning framework itself. So it actually then recognises within the plan, the district plan and the planning framework, the actual housing needs that need to be achieved and desired as part of that process. So it just brings in, I guess, the work around the housing business assessment inside of the district planning considerations and processes more directly.
Yeah, but my question is, if a private developer comes in and wants to put 3,000 homes in one particular area, which blows the numbers that you've already projected for it, then that becomes a constraint in terms of consenting.
So perhaps if I could answer that in a slightly different way. So what the requirement now for the NPSUD is it's setting the bottom line to make sure that we're zoning enough land appropriately to fill that gap of housing shortfall.
Okay. Right. So are you saying that it is an enabler, not a constraint?
Yes, that's right. It's requiring us to enable.
Okay, so that comes to my next question. Responding to insufficiency, when you identify shortages in the assessment, it requires, and that's an interesting word, requires council to notify the minister. And I understand that means the minister can override the district plan to fast track the increase.
So that's probably conflating a couple of different things. So the actual notification to the minister is quite a straightforward process. That is simply telling him what the results of our HBA are and flagging that there is a shortfall there. The response that we take to that is already underway through the plan change 2, and there are additional powers that the minister has in terms of directing how that plan change might progress.
Okay. My last question is, there's nothing in this whole document about the environmental capacity to meet housing demand. I know that the previous document that this our growth strategy replaces was growth management, which was underpinned by a catchment-based approach, that the capacity of development cannot override the ability of the catchment to sustain it. Here, there's no, as close as you come to it, which is talking about the 3 waters and infrastructure, but you only talk about the infrastructure, but not the sustainability of the environment to support that. So there's a huge chunk that's missing. I say this because you remember when you were discussing the housing needs assessment through the briefing, Iwi Ngahapu Otaki's Kirsten Hapta raised the issue of exactly this, whether the environment can maintain or support or sustain the level of growth. And they see houses, not houses, but homes which are related to the environment. So that's missing. And I understand that this particular paper hasn't had a direct engagement with EV partners.
If I can focus on the first part about its consideration environmental aspects, the process that's undertaken looks at the current settings within the current district plan and models those. So there is a number of inputs that are considered in part of the early modelling process about the parameters that could impact potential development under current district plan settings. So that includes the likes of flooding hazards and in particular heritage and wahitapu sites as a number, but otherwise it's directly modelling what's actually currently potentially theoretically enabled under our district plan. So it is that theoretical exercise, but as you quite rightly say, there is a link through in the infrastructure assessment where other factors are considered and factored into the ability for and capacity of infrastructure to support growth and those processes going forward. And there are a number of considerations that are identified in there, such as climate change impacts and a number of other factors that do reflect some of the kind of environmental considerations in meeting theoretical growth. But I guess this is a kind of a theoretical process in modelling that, and of course the real life processes around infrastructure assessment, plan change processes, take in those much more holistic considerations and looking at further and new and different areas of growth. This is just kind of modelling what is currently there under the district plan.
Yes, I just note that there's a gap there in terms of sustainability of the environment and the catchment being able to sustain the level of growth. It's been raised by Mana Whenua, and I understand this paper hasn't gone through them. Yeah, I just note that. That's me. Councillor Compton.
Thank you. Through the Mayor, this week we've had the Infrastructure Commission recommend that in order to plan for enough housing to reduce house price growth by 69%, so house price growth would still grow extraordinarily fast, but not quite as bad as it has been. They were suggesting using a threefold population increase. So rather than 30,000, we'd be looking at 150,000 over that long term in order to get the adequate supply to get house prices somewhat stabilised, I guess. My question's around, given this forms part of the evidence base, it's going to go into things like the regional growth framework and any eventual regional spatial strategy that comes out of the new RMA framework. How would we look to incorporate that sort of expertise from the Infrastructure Commission and their recommendations when we use this NPSUD assessment going into those sorts of processes? I mean, presumably this isn't the only tool we use. We'll look at these other things and incorporate them as well.
I'm wondering, Natasha, whether that's relevant to the work around the Wellington regional growth work, or
yeah. So I think I guess it's to bear in mind in terms of what we've done here is this is making sure we are meeting the requirements that are imposed on us under the NPSUD. Just because another body has punted out a suggestion of something they think would be a good idea doesn't necessarily then mean that we need to rework what we have done to meet their suggestion. Having said that, obviously we do want to make sure that we are planning well and getting the right balance of what we think the community is going to need in the future, and that's why we've been through the process of the district growth strategy. So the other thing Hamish had mentioned before was that this HBA is based on the current district plan settings. Already we've got a draft plan change which is currently out for consultation as of this week, which significantly shifts the dial in terms of the amount of land that we're enabling for housing, both in terms of the height of buildings in some areas and also some smaller additional greenfield areas. And we've got a further plan change planned as well. So what we haven't yet done is gone through this HBA process and refresh those numbers based on what would be enabled through the district plan changes if they progress through in their current form or something similar to their next form. And I think what you'll find there, once we do go through that process, particularly also wrapping in the medium density residential standard changes, is that we will no longer have a shortfall, and probably by quite some margin.
Perfect, thank you.
Councillor Coates.
Hamish, I apologise because I'm pretty sure that this information is in the body of the report or appendices, but how long have we been doing the HBAs? I think the last one was finalised in 2019. So
correct. So this is only our second HBA, and this one's only a partial reflection on the housing only, and because of the recent changes brought forward the timing for the HBA. So the first HBA in 2019 looked at both housing and business demands and capacity. This one only looks at housing, and there's a requirement for another HBA to be completed to inform the LTP for the 2024 period. So as that coincides with the plan changes that Natasha mentioned, there'll be an opportunity to reflect those into the next housing business assessment.
So the one in 2019, did that start in 2016?
No, it started a bit later because the timeframes for the Wellington assessment were a little bit later than some of the other councils that when it came in. I can't quite recall off the top of my head, but it was a little bit after 2016.
I
So,
think if I can,
yeah, go Natasha.
sorry, Councillor Coots. Thank you, Councillor Coots. Sorry to interrupt. Look, I was just going to add in there that I think your line of questioning is probably angling at a frustration that many of the councils have had with that process, and that there is a delay between us going through this process and the baseline that we need to work off through this process to reflecting the present reality. So many of the councils in the region at the moment have already got changes underway that move things on from what these numbers in this current HBA reflect, and there's a constant cycle that we need to go through in terms of we're working off a past reality as opposed to what the future reality is going when we come up with these numbers.
Thanks, Natasha. Look, I think you were close, but not quite. And I guess the question for me, just I wanted to make sure of the basis on which I'm placing the question. So I think from Hamish's response, it's been in the HBA reporting has been in place for around 5 or so years, and we're still in what is referred to a housing catastrophe. So how effective do you as staff think the HBA has actually been in addressing the shortage of housing? And I know obviously just recently we've had the changes to the MDRS around the mandatory upscaling. That to me tells me that some of the stuff hasn't actually been as effective as we'd hoped it had been. So I know a lot of work goes into it. How effective do you think it actually is in terms of shifting the dial?
Well, I think I'll have a go at that, and then Hamish can add on anything if he would like to. I think it's helpful in terms of it puts a number around whether or not we've actually got enough land suitably zoned to fill any shortfall for housing, and it is making us think about those population projections and where we need to be over the next 10, 20, 30 years. What it doesn't do is actually make any policy changes. So it does take up a reasonably considerable resource through the modelling process. It's a reasonably costly exercise to come up with a number that we then need to take further responses to make sure that we appropriately fill any gap that's identified. So it's the response that becomes the most important part in terms of actually shifting the dial, not the report itself.
Thank you, Natasha. One last question, then I'll leave it at that. Would council have done that work anyway, though, understanding how we plan for growth? Would you have thought that as a council, we obviously can't speak on behalf of other councils, but that we would have done that in some way anyway?
I would suggest probably not with the same level of robustness and resource that this takes.
Down to that level, yeah. Yep. Okay, thanks very much.
Councillor Halliday.
Through you, Mr. Chair, and sort of just seeking some clarity on some things to get things right in my head, if you don't mind. And so in the first instance, and just correct me if I'm wrong here, just clarifying, fundamentally, this is just a very, as you just mentioned, Natasha, a very comprehensive snapshot. And I think on Tuesday, I was talking to, when we had the discussion about schools, other infrastructure and that sort of thing there as well. Reading through the report, all that information is there. So would that be a fair call?
Yes, it's a snapshot.
Yep. So on page number 17 on page 15, just some clarity there. It says some modelling of capacity is not reflected in the DPC2 with regards to intensification. So what that's saying is that since this report's been done, obviously things have changed. This is an ongoing cycle every 3 years. We'll pick it up in the next one. We know it's there, but here's where we are in regards to this report. Take that information on board and tie it all together. Would that be a fair interpretation?
Correct. The current changes that are underway under the plan intensification work haven't been reflected in this, but will be reflected in the future iterations of the HBA.
Cool. And that's now going to be an ongoing cycle every 3 years? Yes,
correct.
Okay, cool. A question I have, and it's around number 27. I'm not too sure what page it's on, but it's a general question anyway, page 16. But talks about the assessment or available of planned capacity across the three waters. Now, just for clarity, we still don't know the impact of the three waters reform and how that's going to change or merge our capacity requirements or anything like that. We're pretty much, we're just having to treat it as business as usual and see what turns up and potentially pick that up in the next report. Would that be right?
It hasn't been reflected. The current wider reforms haven't been reflected in here. It's just the current state and available information to assess the available capacity based on those growth forecasts.
And I guess at a functional level, regardless of who who owns or manages the infrastructure still needs to be provided.
Correct. So one, you mentioned, Natasha, this is quite a costly exercise. So one would ask, perhaps government's going to fund that informational report because fundamentally we won't be even potentially collecting the revenue in relation to Three Waters in the future. Look, and also our current policy is growth pays for growth with regards to moving forward. And what we're talking about is a substantial shift with regards to requirement, so that we're actually looking forward, not just dealing with the immediacy of supply, if you like. So I'm assuming this is why we have our capex at a high level at the moment, is that we're actually starting to do that. We're starting to put infrastructure in place that's looking towards growth rather than growth paying for growth. And that's why we've got such a, should we say, larger capex program at the moment. And that potentially will be ongoing and distributing that spend, if you like, over future generations. Would that be about right?
So this doesn't necessarily change the growth pays for growth approach. When we might build the infrastructure as opposed to collect the funds for that infrastructure might change over time as we plan forward. But there's always been an element of the work that we have done through the long-term plan process where we have looked out ahead as to what the infrastructure needs are going to be through the infrastructure strategy and looked at what needs to be upgraded and what new infrastructure needs to be. The shift here is that we've just got a new growth strategy which identifies a number of additional areas and additional requirements that then need to be reflected through that infrastructure strategy, which will be done in time for the 2024 long-term plan.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the report. It's very, very, very interesting.
Councillor Buzzo.
Thanks for the report. I know that this one focuses the focus is on residential development and so forth. The previous one, from my understanding from your comments earlier, was also about business and commercial industrial zoning as well. I'm just wondering, I'm presuming that the next round of this report will be including all of that.
Correct. Yes.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Councillor Compton.
Through the Mayor, I've just got a follow up to Councillor Coote's question. I guess my understanding is that all the housing and business capacity assessments, they're all public documents from right across the country. So in theory, they should have at least partially informed the government and cabinet when they were deciding to make changes to things like the NPSUD and the medium density residential standards. Would that be a reasonable assumption that you would have expected central government to have actually used those as part of the areas of evidence base for making decisions to implement those changes?
Presumably that would be a reasonable assumption, yes.
I guess my follow-up question is, have we actually ever had central government get in touch with us about HBA and any matters of clarification on it?
They have previously undertaken assessments and provided feedback as a process and reflected kind of feedback from across a variety of councils who undertake the HBA, because not all councils have been or do undertake a housing business assessment. So there has been support and feedback as a learning exercise, particularly following the first housing business assessment as to how practice looks like in undertaking them and expectations. And some of that assessment actually fed into the revised update of the housing business the NPSUD in 2020, and some further changes in focusing on requirements of that based on the feedback from the first round that was undertaken.
Cool. So that's good to know that we're not just doing these in a vacuum and our homework's not getting checked. Cool. Thank you.
Councillor Henford.
Yeah, kia ora through the Mayor. Just a quick question from me in terms of how we tell this story to our community. Obviously through the growth strategy and the intensification plan change, there are kind of some specific channels and stories to tell through those, but there's obviously so many different pieces of work being done at different levels, both kind of district-wide, at a district-wide level, at a regional level, at a national level. We've got the housing business assessment, we've got the NPSUD, we've got the medium density residential standards, district growth strategy, district plan. So how do we bring all of that together into some sort of picture of an ecosystem that can then demonstrate the timelines and the roles and responsibilities, so that the community actually knows what the heck all this stuff is contributing to? Because I really do resonate with some of the comments that were made that, yeah, what kind of, how are we seeing anything that's happening from the demonstration, that there is capacity, there's a real need. Obviously there are ways that we're looking to enable that, but how do we kind of show that ecosystem to our community to then say, this is actually what it all aims to deliver, this many houses over this period of time, these are the different parts of the puzzle, these are when they're all kind of being enacted, being reviewed? Because it does just feel, and I'm sure people who might be tuning in or who might kind of be aware of parts of this stuff, to see or to understand how it all fits together is a whole different thing. So I'm just wondering if there is something that already exists that kind of paints that picture, or if it's something we need to look to do.
Yeah, I don't think it fully exists at the moment, but I think there's a number of things underway that will help fill that. I guess the first one was the recent completion of our growth strategy, and that's looking to be supported by a monitoring framework. I think I recall highlighting it at the meeting in March for the adoption of the strategy in February, sorry. And that's intending to bring this HBA alongside other information and reporting we do in a way that can help communicate how it tracks as part of that wider growth framework. And of course, as part of that as well, and that's at the regional level, district level, and then alongside that, you'll be aware of the work underway to develop the housing strategy as well, which is also part of very strong links in and across these. So we see that happening as part of the following on from our district growth strategy, is developing that framework that can actually understand what's going on and communicate it back across a number of these areas that kind of are complementary.
Yeah, perfect. That makes a lot of sense, because it's probably clear for us to understand the different kind of purposes of the pieces of work, but then to understand kind of how they all slot together, is important for our community. So yeah, thank you. It definitely makes sense.
Thank you. No other hands up. Would somebody like to move recommendation A and B? Councillor Hanford, and seconded by Councillor Compton. Councillor Hanford, did you put your hand up to move it?
Oh, yeah, happy to. My hand was just actually left up from my question. But if Councillor Compton did want to, happy for him too, because I did see that he rushed to put his hand up. I'll second. Councillor Compton can move. I'll second.
Is that all right? Councillor Compton? Right, right of intro. Councillor Compton.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank staff for the work that they've done over quite a considerable time and coordinating across the wider Wellington region about this, because our housing market isn't just cloistered within Kāpiti. The idea that we are different islands around the Wellington region, I think, has well and truly been put to bed over the last decade, if not over the last, or since last week when Transmission Gully opened, and we suddenly became a lot closer to our southern neighbours. And actually, within the next few years, we'll progressively get closer to our northern neighbours too. And so this is where this sort of exercise is, I think, really useful, even if I think ultimately that we're being perhaps a bit conservative in terms of our population growth numbers, especially looking at how we've grown over the last 30 or 60 years. It gives us a solid idea of what's likely to happen in terms of the demand side. And we know at a very fundamental level, house prices are a matter of supply and demand. We can't do much about the demand side in terms of what's happening, because transport links have been improving in leaps and bounds over the past decade. We can't do much in terms of, I guess, the dynamics of Wellington, where more people are now able to work from home. I think the figures have been, even when we were in the lower alert levels last year, we still had upwards of 40 or 50% of the public service choosing to work from home. Now, that's bad for Wellington City, but it's been good for us. We've seen that reflected in card spending here. So lifestyle destinations like ours have a lot of attractive factors that are seeing housing demand here, or demand for housing here, rather, I should say, accelerate compared to other places. And, you know, there isn't particularly much you can do to stop people wanting to move here. I mean, we all at some point either chose to relocate to Kāpiti or we chose to remain in Kāpiti for various reasons, and those same reasons are attractive to other people. So what we have to do is figure out how we manage that growth in a way that's environmentally sustainable, but also economically sustainable and socially sustainable for our region. And we've seen huge social pressures, especially in the last 10 years with these infrastructure projects, have seen Kāpiti's housing market become one of the least affordable in the country. And I think this sort of report gives us an indication of the scale of that challenge. We're going to see that get addressed or some of the supply side of it hopefully start to get addressed with the big changes that have come in the NPSUD and the medium density residential standards. But I think as the Infrastructure Commission pointed out, that actually prior to 1977 with the Town and Country Planning Act, the new one that came in there, what actually happened before then is that councils were basically planned for much more rapid population growth than we're actually even looking at now. And as a result, they ensured that they opened up land and planned for that growth to come. And that's what saw prior to sort of the 1970s, that's what saw house prices grow at a reasonable pace and people could keep pace with it. And that whole Kiwi dream of home ownership was kept alive. What we've seen since then is, as has been detailed, there's been this worsening housing crisis. It's turned into a housing catastrophe, which is particularly acute here in Kāpiti because we have a large number of people on fixed income. So we have a lower incomes than the median for Aotearoa. And obviously we've got higher now house prices than the median as well. So we've got the worst of both worlds. So I guess this sort of report puts down a big challenge for our district and also the Wellington region, because we all have to play our part in addressing the housing catastrophe. We all have to accept that there's going to be intensification. We all have to accept that there's going to be population growth. And we need to do it in a way that works around public transport hubs, around our town centres, because housing intensification is the more sustainable way that we can manage this growth than having urban sprawl and low density and those sorts of things. So that's all I want to say on that. And I'm looking forward to the change and the opportunities that this sort of growth will actually bring for Kāpiti in terms of opening up the ability to get a lot of the services and a lot of the facilities that people want to have here, but we don't have that critical mass quite yet to get. We're getting on the cusp of it, and hopefully in the next 10 years is when we'll really start to see the momentum build to get those really critical bits of community infrastructure and services that we need.
Thank you. Open for debate. Do not rush. Councillor Holbrook.
Yeah, I'll just be very brief. Councillor Compton has talked about the things that we need to do. I'd like to just acknowledge the things that we are doing, and Councillor Hanford rattled them off more quickly than I could. But we've got our district plan changes, which are identified in the report and are going to provide extra capacity, and also just very significantly, the briefing that we had on Tuesday on our housing and social needs assessment, or the workshop that we had. And we were told that's one of the most in-depth pieces of work that's being done across the country. So we've also got our open spaces strategy, which ties into these other strategies, looking at the more environmental concerns. And that's just to name a few. So much work going on in this space. And Councillor Hanford touched on a really important kind of aspect, that this, I think it was a beautiful word she used, an ecosystem of these different kind of pieces of work that we're doing. And that's something that we've talked about before, and something that we're kind of trying to work on, but a real challenge when there's just so many different pieces of work going on that complement each other, that interlock with each other, that impact on each other. So yeah, ongoing work, and congratulations to staff.
Thank you. Councillor Halliday.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, I'm not going to rehash the comments of previous councillors because I think they're bang on the money. Thank you very much, Gwyn. I just wanted to thank Hamish and Natasha both, and your teams as well. And also the clear answers that you guys provide with regards to the questioning that we throw as well. The answers that come back certainly do help to clarify what our situation is. So I just wanted to make sure that that's acknowledged, and thank you very much.
Right, let's see. I don't see any other hands up. Recommendation A and B moved by Councillor Compton, seconded by Councillor Hanford. Councillor Compton, do you want to write a reply? I didn't think so. Right, can you cast a vote, please?
Your Worship, we have 10 votes in favour.
Carried. Thank you very much. Can we take I think a 10-minute break?
Good up. Thank you.
Okay.
So, Your Worship, do you want to come back at 10:10?
Yep.
10:11.
Oh, sorry, 10:11. Thank you.
You still haven't wound up your clock.
Yeah.
Right, come back at 10:10.
Thank you.